12, 1994, a quiet night in Brentwood, California. But what happened next would ignite one of the most sensationalized trials in American history. The murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman didn't just shock the nation, it divided it. My name is Emily.
I'm Ava.
I'm Sutton.
And welcome to the Shady Business podcast, where we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, unraveling some of the most chilling and mysterious true crime cases. Before we begin today's episode, we want to give a quick trigger warning. In this discussion, we'll be talking about sensitive topics such as murder, domestic violence, trauma, abuse, etc. If these subjects are triggering or uncomfortable for you, please take care of yourself and feel free to skip this episode or listen with caution. Your well-being is important to us, and we encourage you to listen in a way that feels safe for you. Today, we will be discussing the People versus O.J. Simpson case, a trial that captivated the world, revealing deep divisions in race, celebrity culture, and the American justice system. Let's go back to that fateful night. Nicole Brown Simpson, ex-wife of football star O.J. Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman were found brutally murdered outside Nicole's home. The scene was bloody, chaotic, knife wounds, a violent struggle. Let's talk about the forensic evidence. What do you guys think about that?
Well, there was a lot of things found the night that it happened, such as, the gloves. That was the main thing that was taken into consideration when the court was talking about, the whole case.
I think it was interesting because I think a lot of people forget that it wasn't just Nicole Brown Simpson. It was also one of her very good friends. So having it be a double homicide is really interesting too, because that adds a lot more stress in the situation, and it also creates a lot more forensic evidence to be put into place, I guess. But I think the fact that it also happened in a home where he was frequently present created a lot of problems too, because his DNA would be all over the house and would be on things like kitchen knives and would be on things like countertops and stuff like that. And also this was 30 years ago, when forensic evidence collecting was very different and DNA testing was very different, and just police protocol in general was just different. And I think that's one of the things that Denise talked about, was that I think if this case happened today, it would have had a completely different outcome just due to forensic evidence and the science behind testing and all that different things. I think I think it's interesting how it's all played out.
Sutton, you had the opportunity to interview Denise Brown, and she definitely touched on a lot of different points. Do you want to kind of talk about your key takeaways and things that you've talked about with her?
Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. I can probably speak for all of us that we were really grateful that she came on our podcast, and having just someone that's so prominent in that area. And when it comes to advocacy for domestic violence, I think that she provided a lot of really important insight. But I think the thing that stood out to me the most was just hearing how amazing Nicole was as a person, because I think that when these cases are happening in real time, a lot of the focus is on the suspect and who they are, especially when it's a case like this where it's somebody that's very well known in the space. And so when the shadows are kind of over the people where, they should be highlighted, these are the people that lost their lives. I think it was really interesting to hear who Nicole Brown was and hear from her sister, all of the memories they had, how incredible of a mother she was. I think it created a lot lighter of a conversation, and also just kind of emphasized that this stuff can happen to anybody. And I think that was a really surreal part of the conversation. But I just really appreciated her honesty and her vulnerability and her willingness to really kind of talk about anything. And I think it was also really special with the documentary that just came out, especially her being so connected to it, having her talk about that process and how she was learning new information about the case that she witnessed, but 30 years later, there's new stuff that comes up, and having all the forensic scientists and all that stuff. Yeah, it was definitely really, really interesting. And I learned a lot from her.
Before she spoke, you guys watched the documentary, correct?
Yes.
What did you think about that? And what were her thoughts about the documentary?
I know she was really excited about it just because, like I said, this was kind of the first time in a really long time, if ever, that the spotlight was being put on Nicole and not on O.J. Simpson. Mm-hmm. And I think that she was really proud of it, as she should have been, because it was amazing that she was so closely tied to it, because she had full control over the narrative. And I think that she and her sisters, her 2 other sisters were in the documentary as well. It kind of felt like they kind of took back the narrative for their sister. And I think that was really important and really special. And they also had a ton of Nicole's friends. Kris Jenner was in it. It was really, really interesting to like hear them talk about their friend, even 30 years later. Like they all talked about her like they all saw her last week, and it's very evident that she's still a very huge part of their lives. But it was very interesting. I think they had a really good mixture of, you know, lighter moments and showing like funny home videos. They had a lot of old clips that I had never seen before of, you know, her just taking care of her kids and at her children's dance recitals and stuff like that. And there was just a lot more information that you wouldn't have gotten from like a Netflix documentary. Stuff that they really wouldn't have told bigger news outlets just because, you know, people don't really care about some of the sensitive things. Sometimes people just want to know the facts and want a quick description. And I think that she and her sisters gave a really amazing image of who Nicole Brown was. And I definitely recommend to watch it if you haven't. It's a 4-part series, and it was really interesting. It definitely goes over everything and breaks everything down, but I think it was very well done, and I think Denise has a very good reason to be proud of it.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go into the infamous slow speed chase. So O.J. Simpson was in a white Ford Bronco, driving along Los Angeles freeways, followed by a swarm of police cars. He's running away from the scene, so seems very guilty. So Simpson was armed with a gun, and he apparently was reported suicidal and was eventually arrested in his driveway. So what do we make of this? How did this murder investigation become an American obsession? Because pretty much like everyone, it was like 95 million viewers, something crazy like that. And even like our parents still talk about this. Like they remember watching this chase. So what do you guys think about that?
I just think, I know, Sutton, we kind of touched on this earlier, but I just think this, you know, kind of just goes back. If this were to happen now, it would be a completely different outcome. Like, yes, 95 million viewers is a lot, but we all know, like, when something big happens now in present, it's immediately on social media. Everybody's talking about it. So it's just crazy to think how, like, yes, this was 30 years ago, but it still, you know, had such an impact on everyone. I think the main reason is because of who he was. You know, a lot of people looked up to him. Everyone watched him. You know, he was in like the Hall of Fame, stuff like that. He was a very, very well-known athlete. So that's, you know, people probably did not want to believe that he was on this chase because, like you said, I mean, that just makes him look guilty. So it's just crazy to think about.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because I think nowadays, sitting here in 2024, I think we have a little more awareness that celebrities are human beings too, and I think that we are a lot less shocked when we see that those people are tied to crime and you know, more suspicious or controversial topics. I think yes, they're also in a highlight and a spotlight as well, where those issues that they are attached to do become highlighted very, very quickly. But I just think it's interesting. I think it's also interesting because he was a father, and he was also divorced to Nicole Brown Simpson at the time. So I think that was kind of off the radar. But also there was just such a huge history of domestic violence in their relationship prior that I don't know why there was even a question about his involvement. I mean, in the documentary, to kind of go back to that really quickly, like one of his really good friends that he played football with for several years, he became really, really close to the Simpson family. At their funeral, O.J. Simpson was there, and they were all asking his best friend, like, did he do it? Like, please tell me he didn't do it. And his friend was like, I don't know. And in the documentary, Denise Brown was like, you would think that he would say absolutely not. You would think that he would immediately deny that stuff. But the fact that his best friend knows his behavior, knows his patterns, I just think it's interesting from that standpoint too. And I think that says also a lot about his character and his guilt in this situation.
Right. And doesn't he have like a criminal history of like, didn't he robbed like a store or something?
I think that was after.
That was after?
Yeah,
okay.
That was after. So eventually he did end up going to prison for the robbery and kidnapping.
Yeah, it was unrelated stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. I actually just read that he was also sued by the victims' families for wrongful death, and the civil trial began in October 1996, Less than 4 months later, the jury found him responsible for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman and awarded their families $33.5 million in damages.
Interesting.
Yeah. So let's talk about also the defense lawyers of OJ. So it was how to pronounce his last name, Cochran, Robert Shapiro, and Robert Kardashian. So on the prosecution side, there was Marcia Clark, Christopher Darden, who oversaw this trial.
I find this really interesting just because I like to keep track of like all the really high profile like true crime cases, and Robert Shapiro is a very prominent defense attorney. We'll kind of get into this really like later on, but he was supposed to represent the Menendez brothers, and they just thought that he wouldn't be a good fit for their situation. But he has a huge history of representing a lot of high profile people, and I think when you're O.J. Simpson, you have the money, you have the connections, you have really whatever you want in that situation, which is really unfortunate that someone like that has the upper hand. But I find that very, very interesting, especially with the Robert Kardashian connection as well, especially with Kris Jenner being such a close friend of Nicole Brown Simpson. I think that says a lot about the back and forth, the different sides of this family. I just think it's very, very interesting. I don't know too much about Johnny Cochran, but I do recognize the name, and I know that he had a huge part in getting him off. So I think it's very interesting to look at these names, and it's just I just keep thinking about like if this happened today, it would just be completely different. But yeah.
During the trial, there were 150 witnesses testifying, although Simpson did not take the stand, which is actually interesting because I feel like usually they do take the stand, right?
I'm sure he was advised not to.
Yeah.
I feel like he would have slipped up. I think you see in some cases, like, for example, that sometimes, like, for example, like for like the like Menendez brothers case that we'll talk about. Like, it was good for them to take the stand because their opinions and their story is very, very important to their decision. But I think having O.J. Simpson, I think it was good for him to not take the stand and be questioned because I think he would have fully slipped up and said something he wasn't supposed to. I just don't think he had the media training, and I don't think he had the training from his defense team to do that. I think it'd been really, really good for the prosecution, though, if he had gotten on the stand. But I understand why he didn't. But that all those witnesses is crazy, and I can't imagine how draining that trial would have to be to sit there and listen to all those different people.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so going back to the glove evidence, that was, seen as one of the most, I guess, prominent pieces of evidence that was in the case. Yeah. And basically, just a little overview, there was a glove that was found, I'm pretty sure, in the driveway, and then one the matching pair in kind of like an alley on the property. And it was, such a big piece of evidence because when it was, during the trial, they had brought the gloves out, and one of the most parts during the court case was when they had OJ actually put on the gloves and they didn't fit. And, everyone or people who thought that he didn't do it or were on OJ's side, they were like, oh, like this is, concrete evidence he didn't do it. But then, you go back to how the gloves were, frozen to keep the DNA and evidence, that it could be tested, frozen, unfrozen. So people argue that, is why they didn't fit. So even though like it's an important part, it's so wishy-washy because there's so many different aspects that, could be in favor of him or not. So
I think it's also interesting because I also heard that he stopped taking his arthritis medicine during that time too. So his hands were different sizes. But the freezing is also really interesting because if you were planning on using that evidence in a trial, and most of these trials happen at least a year after the case, after the crime was committed, I feel like there's just has to be some common sense in not freezing that stuff. I get there's DNA, but you're not testing the DNA. You're testing if the glove fits. So I just think it's interesting. I don't know.
I also think it's interesting how the whole entire case took 4 hours, and that was it.
Yeah.
Usually with these things, they can take months,
Yeah.
So it's just like even years sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of people are like, oh, it was rushed. It wasn't, not everything was looked over like it should have been. So there are a lot of different things that you can look at about this case, and it's just like so many unanswered questions and things like that.
I mean, I don't even know how they found an unbiased jury. I mean, like, how do you find people that don't really know who O.J. Simpson is at the time, haven't heard about the case, who are living in who were living in Beverly Hills? Like, I feel these are pretty all like high profile people. Yeah, fans. I mean, he was a high profile football player for several years. He was in the light. He was an actor. He was everywhere. So I just think it's really interesting too. But yeah, I feel like you don't ever see a case that takes
a murder case at that with just so many pieces of evidence.
Yeah. And also, again, it's a big like racial divide as well. A lot of African Americans were in support of Simpson, but a lot of white Americans believed that he was guilty. So race played a big role in that as well.
Also, touching on that, during OJ's case, also the case of Rodney King took place, which was a police brutality case where Rodney King was killed. He was a black man. He was killed due to police brutality. And a lot of people say that case actually helped O.J. Simpson be found not guilty because everybody thought, everyone knew that the police should have been, found guilty for Rodney King's murder, and they weren't. So they really wanted to show that the court wasn't biased and they didn't have any racial bias when it came time for OJ's case. So that was a really important piece as well.
Yeah, I think if we're going into just like the lasting effects that this case had on other cases, I mean, like you said, I mean, this case happened in the LA area, very high profile individuals. And at this time, this was right after the Menendez brothers got convicted. And not convicted. They were waiting for their they got convicted, but they were waiting for their second trial. So their first trial went to a mistrial, but they were still in jail. And after O.J. Simpson, got acquitted, the DA, the district attorney, he was getting a lot of pressure from the area to be more strict on legislation and what was coming throughout the courthouse. And I think that, we could make a whole 2-hour episode on that case, on the Menendez Brothers case. We really, really could. But I think that whole second trial, there was a lot of pressure on him, which is not fair to the Menendez brothers because these two cases are completely different. And I believe they should have had complete opposite verdicts. But I think that, especially in that second one, not having the abuse be allowed into the case. They weren't allowed to mention any of the abuse. I thought that was very ironic, the whole like battered woman syndrome, because they are men and they're not women, and they were children at the time. They weren't allowed to talk about that, and I think that's crazy. But it also goes back into the Robert Shapiro thing too, is that like they could have had the same representation as O.J. Simpson. And they didn't. And they just thought that it wasn't right for them, which is perfectly fine. I mean, it is a completely different situation, but I just think it's very interesting to see like if the tables had turned. But in the New Monsters Netflix series, there's a scene of Eric Menendez being in the cell right next to O.J. Simpson and them talking because their father knew O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was in commercials for their father. Their father was very high up in RCA Records and many other big media companies in LA, and O.J. Simpson had a big part in his career, and I think that's really interesting. But I think just this being in LA just had a huge effect on media, and that's something else that we talked about with Denise too. It's just like the media effects had to be so overwhelming and so overstimulating. So,
yeah, I definitely agree. Actually, I don't want to be like too off topic, but recently, this was October 16th, so 2 days ago. New York Post just put out a news saying that there was a note written by Eric Menendez which linked to his dad during the sexual abuse. So that's a very, very strong piece of evidence that they can bring up in the court for their next trial. in November, right?
Yeah, they just had they just had some press conference with a lot of their family, and that letter was him writing to his cousin Andy, I believe was his name, who actually passed away recently. But this is kind of sparking a new conversation, which is really, really great. It won't be a trial. I think it should be either a resentencing or just a district attorney relook at their case. But I think there's a situation where there could be a retrial, but I doubt it's going to happen just for finances and traumatic reasons. I don't think there's another reason to try it for a third time. Financially, for both sides, I think for the city and for them, I mean, they're in jail. You know what I mean? Like their families have gone through enough. Like I don't think there's any point in trying it a third time. I think relooking at it would be a great thing. But yeah, if only all these cases got the same treatment, it would just be very interesting.
Yeah, I think the big thing that was learned between all these cases is that the criminal justice system just has a lot of, flaws. And I think from learning through these cases, like we can take away that the criminal justice system can do better and can be better. I think that is definitely paving the way for what is to come. So, do you guys have any more thoughts on this?
I mean, like you said, these cases are going to continue to happen, which is really sad. And unfortunately, no matter how much we advocate for these issues and talk about them and raise awareness for them, there's still some really evil and cruel people out there that do things, which is really sad. But I think that, like you said, looking at all these different cases and talking to all these different people, I think it's really interesting to hear what Denise Brown has told us about her sister versus what you get off like a Google search, versus what you get off a documentary, versus what you get off of a Netflix special that's more, fictional, Hollywood style. I think the different perspectives that can come out of these cases is really interesting. And I think it's really important to listen to all these different resources and inform yourself and educate yourself. So I feel so grateful to be able to talk and to be able to have spoken with Denise Brown about her sister and about this case. And I just want to make it very clear that we are in full support of her and her and her sister's story. And I'm very excited to see all the work that she continues to do for the domestic violence survivors.
So as we're wrapping up, thank you so much to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and found it insightful. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, share it with a friend, and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. And as always, feel free to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, which is at Shady Business Pod. We'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and ideas for future episodes. Thank you so much for tuning in. On our next episode, we have a special guest, Instructor O'Toole, who's a High Point University professor and retiree from the Greensboro Police Department and State Bureau of Investigations. We'll catch you next time on Shady Business.